Hello and welcome to Lough Neagh Research Podcast. My name is Louise Taylor, and myself, John Barry, and Calum McGeown from the Centre of Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action, have decided to put it together a little podcast with a little bit of an intellectual and academic focus, but it's definitely we're trying to appeal to as many people and make it as accessible and understandable as possible. So, as I said, my name is Louise Taylor, and I am a political ecologist, ecotherapist, and the founder of a campaign group called Love Our Lough, which was founded off the research which I did. I did my PhD research with Professor John Barry. Under John Barry got me through it, and he got me through it. The work was looking at the relationship between nature experiences and mental health from an ecofeminist perspective. Now, as a result of that research, I became aware of how powerful love was as a political and social agent for change. And I put my money where my mouth is and started Love Our Lough. Last year, as many of you will know, there were shocking images that went around the world of Lough Neagh highly contaminated with blue-green algae blooms. These blooms have not been something that have started recently. Locals particularly are aware that this phenomenon has been happening in the loch yearly, blooms of algae for decades. First research published on it was from the 1970s. However, what happened in 2023 was alarming because not only the scale, but what is now coming up is what those blooms are containing. Algae blooms are something that are a global phenomenon, and they particularly happen in what are called eutrophic lakes, which if I'm probably going to mispronounce things, that's why I'm quite a comical academic. I mispronounce words all the time, but that means eutrophic. So it's like a basin. So there's a lot of nitrates or nutrients that go, and these blooms will be naturally occurring. But the difference with Lough Neagh is it's hypereutrophic or eutrophic, and that means that a lot of these blooms are dangerous in different ways because of what they contain. So the crisis of Lough Neagh has done something pretty powerful in many ways because it's brought people together, and there's been quite a few campaign groups started, not just Love Our Lough with me, different campaigns, and there's an energy being created and people are coming together, and that's what we're hoping to do with Lough Neagh Research. We're hoping to hold a space in the shape of a podcast. We're wanting to have guests who are working and doing very, very important work, or whether that be in the academic field, whether that be in journalism, whether that be in the community, and we want to hear about what they think of this crisis and what they think needs to be done, because Lough Neagh, I am calling it the heart of the North. I think it's highly symbolic of how we have been failed as a population, how we've been failed as the six counties, how we've been failed as, with the colonialism and the conflict and different things. So it represents something very powerful, and we would like in Lough Neagh Research to bring people's ideas together and give them a space to express that. So we've also, myself and my co-hosts, we've also done research recently, and I'm going to pass over to John to tell us a little bit about the research that we worked on and what we've published. And so we'll start with that and then move on to Dr. Neil Reid, or move to Calum, and then we'll hear from Dr. Neil Reid. Okay.
That's great. Thank you, Louise. And it's great that this is happening. And just before I go on to describe the research that the three of us did in a report we published over the summer called Paradise Lost, and if people are interested in it, it's available to download from the Centre for Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action at Queen's University Belfast. It's freely available. It was based on interviews that Louise mostly did, and Calum did some as well. But before I talk about some of the findings of that piece of research, in many respects, this podcast is a replacement for Trad Point. There used to be a freshwater laboratory on Lough Neagh out of the University of Ulster, and some wonderful academics and local residents and activists now, like Dr. Les Gornell. That's where he did his training, and that was, let go for probably, I don't know quite know what the reasons were, probably money. And it's an awful shame, to say the least, given what's now happened, that we have no research facility based physically on the loch. And that's something I know that Louise is particularly passionate about. But in advance of having a replacement for Trad Point, this podcast at least is a gesture in the direction of gathering together, as Louise said, academic, activist, other initiatives are trying to look at the causes, the consequences, and what are the solutions and remediation strategies that we can look at in Lough Neagh. And of course, the reason is that, as Louise said, Lough Neagh is, the heart of the north, or the jewel of the north, but also because, a lot of our drinking water comes from there. It's a major driver of the economy in terms of, tourism, the eel industry, and so on. And then just a segue into the report we did, there's also an important emotional and mental health dimension of both the use of Lough Neagh, but also now what's happening to it, which I can only describe as ecocide. We are seeing in real time now genocide in Gaza and ecocide in Lough Neagh. And then maybe at a later pod, we can have a discussion about how I see these two things as inextricably linked. What we're now seeing on a global scale in the Middle East and what we're seeing here locally are, to me, connected in various ways. But the report that the three of us wrote, as I said, was called Paradise Lost. And some of the findings of it were, as you would imagine, there was a deep sense of loss, of grief. There was a lot of grief. Some of the respondents that we interviewed, who had lived by the loch for decades, had no faith that it was ever going to recover. So they were kind of fatalistic. The loch is dead now. Those who, were grieving, maybe not all felt that the loch was dead and irrecoverable, but they had a lot of anger, and particularly anger towards our systems of governance, the state. There was also, discussion about the role of agriculture, and it's important to say it wasn't about the vilification of individual farmers. And I think there will be later pods where we're looking at farming and the role of farmers as stewards of the land. They're part of the solution, but the reality being that, for example, the going for growth strategy of the Northern Ireland executive from 2013 has now, in hindsight, been a disaster in that it incentivized too much beef and dairy, which then led to, to use a non-academic phrase, but one that I think is the only way to describe it. The problem in Lough Neagh is shit, poo, crap, whether it's human or bovine. That is the problem in the loch. We need to find ways of removing what the media politely calls nutrients. So whenever you hear nutrient enrichment on BBC Ulster, think shit, because that's exactly what the issue is. And so for us in this research, we wanted to look beyond the kind of science and the kind of big P politics and the economics, although we touched upon those. And it was more about the human stories. And I'll just finish on that. And that, we hope this pod will, yes, discuss those big issues, going for growth, and what's the agroecological, nature friendly, regenerative friendly farming we need, and so on. But it's also about, giving the space for ordinary people who live and have an interest and love the loch, to use the phrase from the campaign Louise set up, Love Our Loch, that we don't talk about enough in politics, issues of love, of compassion, of kindness, because these things are seen as very private. We don't talk about emotions, certainly not in the academy, the world I come from. And I think that's to our great detriment, that we can talk about the evils of capitalism, give it one name, and at the same time talk about our emotional, impact of, what we're now witnessing in Lough Neagh. So I'm looking forward to, co-hosting, pods and inviting on interesting guests that will talk about the myths of Lough Neagh. Like, one of the issues that I found, I'll just finish on this, that I found I didn't know was the mythic stories around Lough Neagh, like Lee Ban, the kind of mermaid, but also that, in Irish mythology, Lough Neagh was scooped out of the ground by Fionn McCool and thrown at some other giant and missed them and landed in the Irish Sea to become the Isle of Man. Now, of course, we know geologically, scientifically, that's not the case, but these stories and the emotional resonance of these stories are as important as, discussions of eutrophication, nutrient management, regenerative farming. So it's that kind of 360 holistic perspective we want to bring to this pod. So I'm really looking forward to it. And I'll now pass like a baton over to Calum in terms of his interest and why he's interested in this particular new pod.
Yeah, thanks, John, and thanks, Louise. Um, really looking forward to this new podcast. I think precisely for what John spoke about and Louise as well, and what that research for me represented is that centering of people and communities. It's something that academia generally does quite badly, um, just doing research for research's sake. So I really want to find those stories as well, but also lean into that responsibility of what I think it means to be a researcher, particularly for someone who has researched the politics, the political economy of our planetary crisis. Lough Neagh for me represents the very front line of that in our backyard. Um, and if we as researchers, as citizens, as politicians, population in general, aren't ready and prepared to kind of take up that challenge head on, then we're really missing the point. Um, so yeah, again, just to repeat, I guess what's already been said, I'm looking forward to where this podcast goes. I'm looking forward to the inevitably interesting and perhaps challenging conversations that we'll have, and hopefully have a bit of crack along the way. But I think that'll probably do us for now in terms of the short introduction. We're going to start off the first full episode with a conversation with Dr. Neil Reid, reader at Queen's University Belfast, who has recently done some very important research on Lough Neagh, and we'll let Neil introduce himself. Okay, so for our first episode, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Neil Reid. Neil is an academic based at Queen's University Belfast. He's also a co-author of a recent article about the unprecedented harmful algal bloom at Lough Neagh. So welcome, Neil, and thanks for coming on. Wondering if we could start just by maybe giving a brief introduction to yourself, your research interests, maybe why you were compelled to do this research at Lough Neagh, and some of your main findings.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me. So yeah, I'm a reader of conservation biology at Queen's. So I'm interested in the impact of human beings on the natural world, principally because most of my research is here in Ireland that focuses largely on agriculture and our protected areas in Ireland, both north and south. So at the moment, I'm involved in an island-wide otter survey to estimate otter populations because that's a designated species at a European level. We've also just started the Northern Ireland white-clawed crayfish survey. So again, that's one of our few threatened and endangered species here. So I work on those kind of species, but also interested in the impacts of agriculture, agri-environment schemes, these kind of questions. What works in conservation? So before and after, these kinds of things. In terms of Lough Neagh, I'm a Lough Neagh native, so I actually come from the western shore of Lough Beg, which is just above Lough Neagh, but it's all part of the same area of special scientific interest. So I'm a stone's throw from Church Island. That's where I grew up, although I've lived in Belfast for 25 years, but I'm a native of Seamus Heaney country. And I suppose just like him, I feel very culturally identified with Mid-Ulster. So, and then with the professional interest in conservation biology, when the blue-green algal blooms really came to the fore in 2023, Lough Neagh is, our largest intact contiguous ecosystem in Northern Ireland, save for all of that grassland that we have, which I'm not counting because it's not necessarily natural. So I felt compelled. That was a subject area that needed some attention, and that I wanted to be involved in looking at that, and particularly describing the bloom. You know, there are other organizations and other individuals that are working on Lough Neagh, collecting lots of data, but getting that information out into the public domain, having it published, was something that I felt was quite important to put down a marker as to what had actually happened during that event. And of course, we're then seeing it happen again in 2024.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Could you maybe remind us of the title of your article? And we'll make sure actually to make sure there is a link to it so that people listening can access it as well.
Sure, like all these things, it's quite wordy and technical. You know, like every specialism, there's technical jargon. But it was entitled "Unprecedented Harmful Algal Bloom in the UK and Ireland's Largest Lake, Associated with Gastrointestinal Bacteria, Microcystins, and Anabinopeptins, Presenting an Environmental and Public Health Risk." So that's fairly long and wordy. But really just shining a light on, first of all, that Lough Neagh is really important because it's very large. It's in both the UK and the island of Ireland. So it has strategic importance. We know it drains 47% of our land. We know it provides 40% of our drinking water. So to find unpleasant bacteria in there, in addition to the blue-green algae, and then the fact that the blue-green algae produces toxins is, of course, of important import, both in terms of the health of the natural environment, the ecosystem, but also very much in terms of our drinking water, impacts of agriculture, and all of these other things.
Neil, I find the paper, I find the way you communicated about the paper really, really important too when it came out, because it came out in July, isn't that right? It was published.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, middle of July, I think.
Yeah, and you were trying to make it as accessible as possible. Okay, so from your perspective, what do you think is the most important takeaways from that research that you want the public to become aware of that they maybe didn't know prior to you doing that work? What do you think are the key messages you would like the public to think when they think of your findings?
Well, I suppose that we can look at Lough Neagh and see without any scientific measurement that there's a great problem there, that there's this horrible green slick around the edge, and particularly in places where people come into contact with it. So where our prevailing winds come from the west, and so it blows all this algae in the water to the east. And so particularly Antrim, where there's quite a high population, that's an area that's quite bad in terms of the algae. So we can see and smell and taste in the air that it's not pleasant. But the takeaway messages, I suppose, are that not only is this physically unpleasant to look at and be around, but it's actually it can be toxic. So these bacteria, so it's called blue-green algae, but of course this is actually a photosynthetic bacteria. It's not a plant. And as part of its biochemical processes, it liberates a whole suite of toxins. So we looked at a number of commonly occurring toxins, but also then we looked for a whole suite of toxins that haven't really been looked at before. So it liberates what we call microcystins. And then we looked for other things which are called anabinopeptins and modularin. And these things if they get into particularly mammal bodies, so bodies like our own, livestock, pet dogs, these kinds of things, a little bit on your skin is going to cause you maybe a bit of irritation, potentially a rash. If you actually ingest a little bit of it, you could feel a bit nauseous and a bit sick. But actually, if you ingest enough of it, this stuff goes to the liver, it gets into the nerve cells, and it disrupts cellular processes at the cellular level. And enough of it can be fatal. So we have seen around the loch instances of dog deaths, dog walkers walking their dogs and they go into the water, and by the evening they're dead. So that's not being caused by an infection or something that takes some time. That's something that's fairly swift. And whilst we cannot say that those deaths are associated with these toxins, certainly they seem consistent, plausible, that that's the case. And so, if I was a dog walker, I wouldn't be letting my dogs go into the water and lap the water when the blue-green algal bloom is in force, because these toxins are there. And what we find, I suppose the takeaway message is that we find that these toxins Some of them were above the World Health Organization recreational exposure limit. So in some places where particularly the sludge builds up, they get into quite high concentrations. And that's really quite concerning as to what can happen then if a dog or livestock or wildlife, we've seen also pictures of dead swans, dead otter, and so on come into contact. But the surprising thing, I suppose, is that we also then looked for what bacteria were in there. So it's not just the blue-green algae that's in the water. And when it blows ashore, it creates these big, thick, sludgy mats. And in fact, the top of it, if you scrape it, I've had the pleasure of putting my hand into it and scraping it to lift off samples. And of course, the top of it's that bright green substance. Sometimes it's blue, sometimes it's yellow, depending on what bacteria there. But as soon as you break that surface, you're getting into an oxygen devoid environment. It becomes very anoxic and brown sludginess. And in fact, what's in there are a totally different suite of bacteria, not just blue-green algae. And so the blue-green algae dies and it gets decomposed, and it gets decomposed by E. coli, Salmonella, Clostridium. And in fact, we find lots and lots of bacteria, but about 13 of them we were able to identify as species that can make human beings ill. So these are things typically of gastrointestinal tracts. They live inside our guts naturally. They live inside livestock naturally, the wildlife naturally. But here they're proliferating to a high degree. So 80% of the bacteria in these sludges are those bacteria that can make us ill. So again, if you're working on boats and you're handling ropes or fishing gear, you're touching your face, etc., you could become easily infected by these things. And people who are immunocompromised, these can be quite unpleasant things to get. So I suppose it was highlighting both the combination of the toxins, but also these gastrointestinal bacteria actually produce a really unpleasant cocktail that we really don't want in our environments, and we certainly don't want our pets and our children and our livestock coming into contact with it.
Yeah, that is fascinating in a quite frightening way. And maybe just for the sake of clarity, Lough Neagh becomes a frequent news item during the summer weather, the hot weather, when you have those big algal blooms, right? We've seen the last 2 years in particular, it's been quite unprecedented levels. So what you're saying is that, yeah, that happens. You have that sort of physical, the very visible manifestation of those blooms, again, bacteria. But this cocktail of bacteria is always there, right? It's kind of present in the water throughout.
Absolutely. So, most of these kinds of species will be naturally in the lough anyway. So there's lots of them. You could say that lots of these, E. coli, for example, will be in the feces of wildfowl and swans. So that's there. But also we know there's an awful lot of agricultural runoff coming down into the lough over a period of decades, going back to 50s and the 1950s and beyond. So, these things are there, but typically they're at a low level throughout the lough, but under the right conditions, it promotes the growth of these, promotes the growth of the blue-green algae, and then when it blows ashore, that promotes degradation and the growth of these other bacteria. And the conditions that cause that, well, we probably don't know enough about those conditions, but we know that the lough has increased in temperature by 1 degree over the last 2 decades. That doesn't seem like a lot, but it means that the peak temperatures in summer get really quite warm. So, they were getting to 17 degrees, last year and the year before. Well, you're getting into almost tropical fish tank territory there. Guppies would live in that quite happily. So it's getting quite warm. It's quite shallow. We've got lots of nutrients going into it from agriculture and human waste, so it's very highly polluted with nutrients. There's lots of nutrients for the growth of these things. And then this other issue that's came up is zebra mussel. So we have a non-native mussel that comes from down near Ukraine, Russia, that's been introduced. It's spread all across the world. It's quite common in lots of places now, but it filter feeds, and so it's constantly straining out normal green algae. Lough Neagh should be pea green soup, and it's straining all of that out. And so actually now when you go out in spring to Lough Neagh and you look into the water, it's crystal clear in places. It's become really clean, and people think that that's a good thing, and in fact that's a bad thing, because all the natural green algae has been strained out, but because the blue-green algae contains toxins, they essentially spit it out in what is called pseudo-feces. And so what you're left with is lots of blue-green algae in the water, and then lots of light can penetrate the lough to a much deeper depth than it did a few decades ago, because we didn't have these things until about 2005. And so lots of light promotes growth and photosynthesis. So this cocktail of temperature, climate change, eutrophication, and invasive species has caused the perfect conditions for the last few years, these kinds of blooms. But these blooms did occur in the past, the 1950s, 1960s, and 70s. But when we look back at the literature there, they were caused by different bacteria. So you get a whole different species. There are lots of different species of blue-green algae. And in the past, it was caused by other species. And that those have now changed over time as the conditions of the lough change over time. So some might be more suited for cooler water temperatures in the past. Some might be suited for warmer conditions now. So the current problem is being caused by a bacteria called Microcystis aeruginosa, and that's different from what would have caused past blooms. But you're absolutely right. This stuff is in the lough, and there would be a totally natural cycle of algal bloom anyway in all lakes during summer. As summer ramps up, plants grow. So we would normally see a peak in summer, but it's just that the conditions now are combining in such a way that it's really promoting this one species, this Microcystis aeruginosa, which has gone bananas because of the amount of nutrients that are around, and probably the influence of the zebra mussels as well.
So you're Lough Beg, or near Lough Beg. You were brought up near Heaney country, and that's brilliant. And I think one of the things that about being involved with the campaign, that it's actually witnessing it and seeing it close up, and how did that, like, that impacts on a different way. So academics, I think one of the problems sometimes with academia is they try and be objective, and they try and be detached, and they don't really encourage that personal, that really emotional, that deep love. Actually, John and I did an article about academia opening their hearts and really loving what they're doing. And I just think, how has it impacted you? Because that was one of the things for me, like witnessing it, bearing witness. A lot of people talk about it's horrific. It's horrific. You're talking about it in very scientific terms, but I walk the Trim Canal and it's choking. There's no way that's good for anybody. I look at that river and I'm like, nothing can live in that. But I think sometimes academics are like, we've got to go with the science. We've got to go. We can't be emotionally, personally connected. But I actually would argue that that's actually probably why you were so quickly out of the gates. Why you were able to, because you were really passionate about it. So can you tell us a little bit about how it's impacted you, maybe, witnessing the lough in that state?
Well, I suppose before I get to me, I suppose it's a wider issue. Actually, I suspect a lot of people who even live relatively close to the lough, around the lough, are actually quite detached from it. They rarely visit the shore of it. It's only the people who actually physically live on the shore of it who really see it and are going down to the shore. But because an awful lot of Mid-Ulster, for example, gets its water from Lough Neagh, then we have, in more recent weeks, we've had lots of claims of the water. For example, there perhaps been a smell or a taste of the byproducts of the breakdown of the algae in the autumn. And this has made it a much wider issue in the Mid-Ulster area. So people who live tens of miles from the lough shore are now becoming much more aware that there is a problem. And I'll be entirely honest, whilst I'm a native of the lough and have often gone to the edge of the lough, I hadn't actually spent a great deal of time out in the lough. And so it was only as a result of going out on a boat to collect these samples that I literally went to every part of the lough. And I suppose it's always surprising, once you're out in the middle of it, just how gigantic it actually truly is. It's almost like a small inland sea. So, I think people don't often think about that. I suspect if this lake was elsewhere, if it was in the Lake District where there was lots of tourists coming, it would be a much more popular site. There'd be big hotels built around the edge of it with spectacular views, and there'd be all kinds of uses of the water. But in fact, I suspect because we're quite a rural agricultural community that lives on the land rather than fisher folk. I appreciate that there are fisher folk on the lough and there's eels harvested from the lough, but most people around the lough are not connected to it. And so I suspect actually we've forgotten that it was there, and it was only when this problem suddenly presented itself that it made itself really obvious in people's awareness. And so you're absolutely right. When I was going down through particularly Toom Lough, particularly the Antrim boathouse, where it's draining out and it's being blown ashore. First of all, the bright green color, it looks horrific and it's really sludgy. It almost looks like plasticine once it covers rocks and tree trunks and things. But then the smell is particularly unpleasant. And as you say, I've got a very strong constitution. I dissect dead animals that have maybe lain on the road for some days. And so I'm usually fairly strong. But even I thought that the smell was it would make you gag on occasions, particularly if you're taking samples and you're breaking the surface. It's very, very strong. And I was speaking to some of the people there who work on the Lough Gate or work at the Antrim Boathouse, and they were saying being there all day, every day, they feel that they're going home with a headache, they're feeling nauseous. Interestingly, I brought the samples back to the lab after being out on the lough all day. And first of all, even in the middle of the lough, you could smell it at that time. And when I brought the samples back, I had to process some of the samples before going home. And so I'd be homogenizing them, opening the containers, pouring them from one to the other. And I had to open all of the windows. I had to prop open the door in the corridor to let the air through. And I did on both evenings go home with a headache. And I did think to myself, do these toxins aerosolize and you're actually breathing them in? And again, I don't think there's enough research on that, whether that actually is the case or whether it's just that after smelling something bad for so long, that's our natural reaction of disgust. I'm not sure whether that's the case, but certainly I can totally appreciate that for the people around the lough, it's very unpleasant to see and very unpleasant to smell. And as you say, it then evokes that, none of us want to see our environment in such a poor state. So, for someone who is very passionate about the environment and wildlife, it's quite distressing to see that occurring.
But also that's why I think your paper, like your background's conservation biology, isn't that right? And your paper, first out of the gate, conservation biologist, but this is a public health. So you've made that connection, and finally people are starting to connect environmental issues with actually the health of the population, which for so long, why do you think that's taken people so long to make that link? Because that's what your paper's doing. So where's medicine, where's the health services, where's public health? That research needs to be coming. And you were quick out, but it was from a conservation perspective, whereas you're conclusively stating this is public health too. So that's quite groundbreaking, I think, in terms of research, and quite exciting too for the future.
I think this is an issue which is really a global pervasive issue, in that people see human beings, particularly urbanized populations, as being separate from nature, that nature and people are somehow different, that human beings are unnatural, and you have to go out into wilderness to go to see nature, when in fact, of course, nature, as I've just been lecturing for the last 2 weeks to my students, is our life support system. It produces the oxygen we breathe. The phytoplankton and the plants produce all of our oxygen. It sucks the carbon dioxide that we're currently rapidly putting into the atmosphere out of the atmosphere. So photosynthesis is locking it away. So it clarifies and cleans our water for our drinking water. It provides all of our food, so we need healthy soils. Everything is our life support system. And as I say to students, we're currently playing a game of Jenga, those wooden blocks that you might play at Christmas, and every person has to take out a block and the tower starts to wobble, and whoever knocks the tower over loses. Well, we're currently doing that and have been doing that with the natural world for some time, where we're removing all of its component parts bit by bit. And of course, the tower stands for a very long time, but currently we're seeing the tower wobbling, and it's a dangerous game to be playing. And I think people haven't, until very recently, connected human health, human well-being, there's also a huge epidemic of depression and anxiety, particularly amongst younger people. And I think part of that is caused by the disconnection to nature. We're all plugged into screens all of the time. And we know very well that one of the best ways to feel a bit better is to get out into nature, to be exposed to greenery, to listen to birds, to see the babbling brook. And when you come back from it, you'll feel a little bit better. And if you do that every day, it really begins to impact your mental health and well-being. So, that's becoming increasingly recognized, but it's almost at the point where the system is beginning to break. It's almost at the point where it's almost too late, but we're beginning to recognize that now. And I think there is still a bit of a, in conservation, and particularly the reporting of conservation more generally, there's still this idea that it's kind of a bit woolly and it's a bit tree huggery. And we have to talk about, the impact of the blue-green algal blooms on nature, when in fact, as you quite rightly, the blue-green algal blooms are really about human health, well-being, food, the fish that are caught from the loch. These are hard-nosed medical and economic issues. And we shouldn't confuse those with being something fluffy, because in fact, the fluffy end is actually really quite important for our well-being and our health.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's all so on point and really important. And for me, when I think of Lough Neagh, I think it's kind of symbolic of so much of what you said for us on the island of Ireland. It shows what happens as a result of that disconnect. Along with much of the issue around monocrops, grass and all the rest of it, but also I think when you talk about the well-being aspect as well, is when you do now try to connect with these natural places, you're confronted with the reality of what has happened to them as the result of different processes and so on. And that itself, again, then speaks to the broader issue of our climate and ecological crisis on a global level as well, because obviously this is unprecedented here for Lough Neagh, perhaps to the extent that it is, although you've already spoke to these things do build up over time. But similar environmental and ecological crises are happening all around the world. I think that for me is one of the reasons why it's so important to have engaged research and maybe for academics to reflect on their role, the skill, the knowledges that they have, and which I think that you've really well exemplified with this report, is that it's responsive to an immediate issue, and really hoping that many more kind of follow in your lead. I know that Lough Neagh desperately needs that. But I'm wondering, again, with your sort of scientist hat back on, is there anything from the findings of your research or your general idea of what's happening at Lough Neagh? What do you think are the key issues that either you want to take on or other scientists, academics should be taking on?
And well, one of the things that I was keen to do in the paper was, scientific papers tend to be extremely narrow and focused on one specific expertise. And whilst we looked at blue-green algae, and we looked at toxins, we looked at bacteria, I was keen to then widen that out into the broader perspective. So at the end of the paper, we produce a pictogram, a diagram of the Lough Neagh catchment, which is basically a map of Lough Neagh kind of cut in half. And there I've tried to identify as many of the issues around the loch that is contributing to the blue-green algal blooms as we possibly could. And they range from, we've got an extremely dispersed rural population that live in bungalows and houses across the countryside. So they've all got septic tanks. So septic tanks is a big issue in Northern Ireland. A lot of that nutrients in those septic tanks are leaching out into groundwater, and they get into our waterways and they get into Lough Neagh. But then we have, of course, the agriculture. So, we can't forget, or we shouldn't forget, we often think that Ireland is a a natural place because it's green, you know, with the Emerald Isle, green is somehow natural. But of course, 75% of our land area is grassland. And that grassland wasn't there thousands of years ago. It is only there because we cleared oak woodland. And as a result, that's mostly, you know, we don't have a lot of natural habitats within that matrix. So our little bits of woodlands that's left, or little bits of peatland that's left, are very scrappy and small, and even they're degraded. So we've got a grass desert. It's not green and natural. It's a grass desert on which we put lots of nutrients. So there's lots of slurry, artificial fertilizers. So that's another issue. We pointed out in that figure that also our uplands, our spurns, mountains have been completely denuded. There are no trees up there. It's covered in sheep, which are also then, you know, that's causing downstream flooding. The water runs off the mountain really quickly. It's eroding the peat, and the peat's really important for locking away carbon dioxide. We have the bits of forest that we do have are not normal broadleaf native forests. They're conifer forests. So they're Sitka spruce brought from Scandinavia, in which very little biodiversity lives. And then when we clear fell them, we get a lot of soil erosion, a lot of peat erosion occurring. So there are all of these myriad of different issues in the landscape that actually in Lough Neagh is a great example, because it literally is a basin that catches them all, you know, and everything drains into this big shallow puddle in the middle. And so it kind of exemplifies the problem, because it then gets really concentrated. And I went, it's now a few years ago, but I was over in Mayo for a holiday, and rented a cottage, you know, going into nature. Let's get back into the West, where it's still, we can get away for people from a while. And went to Achill Island, and I opened the visitor's book in the cottage, and lots of people had written, you know, very nice messages. My goodness, isn't it spectacular? It's beautiful. It's so remote. It's so natural. It's stunning, and all of the rest of it. And I came away thoroughly depressed after a weekend, because all I saw was utter ecological devastation. You know, all of the peat bogs had been denuded, were eroding, were overgrazed by sheep. There was no natural forest cover. All of the plants were non-native invasives, you know, Patagonian fuchsia, you know, South American gunnera. You know, you've got that Montbretia along the road that people actually wrote. Isn't it fantastically beautiful? And it's just replacing our native fauna. We've got loads of salmon fisheries in the sea. And I just saw a completely devastated landscape, and yet most people were mistaking it for beauty.
Yes.
And you know, we're in a really dangerous territory, that if we can't differentiate devastation from beauty, and we've got a real problem on our hands, which goes back to that disconnect of people not knowing the history and the impacts that we're having on the landscape more generally.
Shifting baseline syndrome.
Shifting baselines,
Yeah,
yes.
so there the struggle is real, Neil. You're so educated that you can't look at it. You can't see it.
This is what I'm saying to all my students. You know, by the end of the course, they will see the world as I see it, and it's a difficult thing to see. You know, when you go out into a woodland and yet all you see is non-native species, or non-native trees, or whatever it is. And so I see it 24 hours a day, and most people who walk down the street are utterly unaware of it.
Yes. Yeah.
And each generation, as you say, it then gets worse, because you know they don't miss what the generation before identified. My parents talk about corncrakes that kept them awake at night when they were children in the 40s and 50s. And I hadn't heard a corncrake until a few years ago, and I went specifically to Rathlin Island to hear one. But you know, I heard cuckoos when I was lying in bed as a child. But now the younger generation are going to hear neither of these things, because they're so rare, and they don't miss them because they've never encountered them before. And so we don't really realize just how, I suppose the scientific technical term is depauperate the world is, but how impoverished it has become.
Well, this is my work with the ecological grief, the ecological trauma, and using that as so then getting involved in the activism as a way of countering that, and taking your power back, and feeling enthused and creating, making a difference. So yes, so Neil, this brings us to, you know, so you've published the paper. And it's exciting because it is accessible, and that's what I really respect, academics who make their work as accessible as possible. I think that's so important. So, in terms of the politics, in terms of, do you think it's important for academics to get involved in that, creating the change that's needed, or do you think that's not something that you feel particularly comfortable with?
I think there's always a danger here. I deliberately, I did the sampling of the work in 2023, and in the subsequent year that it took to publish, I was very frustrated at how long it was taking me to get the thing published, because I wanted to have some form of political influence and to inform the process going forward. But actually publishing something in a year is remarkably swift. But it's always frustrating when the politics is going faster than you can keep up. And, I was approached quite a lot by the media for comment on Lough Neagh, and I declined everything throughout that year, because even though I had worked on Lough Neagh before on ducks and Lough Neagh flies and things, I didn't feel as if I knew enough to be able to say anything authoritative about what was going on with the blue-green algal blooms. Although I know plenty of people were quite willing to go on the television and talk at length about these things. And so I was keen to wait until I had information which I could convey that I was comfortable doing so. So after the publication of the paper, then I've engaged quite extensively with the press and the media and the BBC and various others in order to get that message out, so that those in political authority, the minister, DERA and others, will now have that information at their fingertips and available to them in order to influence them going forward. And as a result, we're engaging now with that process. So we have the Lough Neagh management plan that's been published. We've had then, the Small Business Research Initiative released in order to try and come up with various remediation plans. So I've been involved in a couple of those as well. And going forward, we're trying to engage politically with DERA and others in order to get a kind of a head of steam behind the science behind it. Now, that's where things diverge a little bit. I'm a scientist. I'm here to provide information to inform all of this other political sphere. I'm not necessarily the one then to be there to take the action, but I'm keen that we then broaden that out so that we have we used to have a research station on Lough Neagh that was decommissioned in the early 2000s. Now we're looking at re-ramping up a lot of Lough Neagh research. So we are seeing this, in the next 2 weeks, we'll have 4 PhD students starting here at Queen's, who will all be focused on Lough Neagh. And then, of course, there are other research opportunities coming down the track as well. So I hope that over the next few years, we'll rebuild up a certain amount of momentum in order to examine Lough Neagh in much greater detail in order to try and fix the problem.
As with a lot of these conversations, we do discuss some quite heavy and at times depressing bits as well. But as you alluded to, I'm sure you do have really valuable and positive experiences when you are in natural places, despite being surrounded by our mountains that are stripped bare and so on. Once you see that, it is very hard to unsee. But maybe to try and end things on a more kind of positive note, when you were thinking about Lough Neagh and this place that deserves our respect, it deserves our effort to really protect it, both in and of itself, but for us as part of this ecosystem on the island and further afield. When you were doing that research, did you have any surprising or particularly impactful or beautiful nature encounters that you could tell us about?
Yes. So when I went out on the boats, I spent 2 days, 8 hours a day out on the loch, and we were zipping around to get to random GPS coordinates that, of course, had no meaning to anyone. They were just points on the loch to take samples. But we stopped off on a number of locations in order to have lunch. And so we stopped off on Coney Island, which is in the south west of the Lough. And we stopped off on Rams Island. And I hadn't been to Coney before, I had been to Rams. And islands are always, I'm kind of an island bagger, as they say. I like to go to islands. They're biologically really interesting and exciting places, normally off the coast anyway. And so I hadn't really been to the islands on Lough Neagh. And just because we were then the only two human beings on the island, me and the guy driving the boat, first of all, you're struck by how peaceful it is. So you're away from the coast. You can't hear any traffic noise or whatever. So first it was all very, very peaceful, but also, they're covered in forest, woodland, and the trees are quite mature and some really big and very, very old trees. And they've got a really fascinating cultural history of how they were colonized and lived on in the past. But it also struck me that, that's the kind of landscape that should cover most of Northern Ireland. And it's only there because we can't get to it and deforest them. But actually being in that environment is very calming. As I say, I find it very peaceful. I was able to go off by myself for 15 minutes and sit and eat my sandwich. And you can hear the birds singing, you can hear the water lapping. So those are wonderful, wonderful places. And it just reminds me of how restorative it is to be in nature and how it should be all the way around Lough Neagh, really.
Yes, it should. That I love Coney. I haven't been on Rams yet, but Coney's so gorgeous. I do think that's really important that you're aware, especially for somebody, Neil, with your level of education and awareness, that you still enjoy the beauty and you still, find those spaces. But we do have a lack of high quality nature spaces that we can be immersed in. But hopefully that'll change. The solution. So is there anything you'd like to say before we finish our first ever Lough Neagh research podcast?
Yeah, well, I suppose thinking about the solutions, what do we do about it? There's a lot of depression, the fact that it might take decades to fix the problem. And what do we actually have to do about it? Well, the problem is mostly nutrients getting into the lough. And there, what we really need is what we call nature-based solutions. So there will be a lot of talk about technical solutions. This DERA SBRI, employing small businesses to come up with solutions. Those will be probably mostly technical solutions that we can invent our way out of the problem, that we can inject something into the system that will clean it up immediately. And I have no doubt that maybe some technologies will come forward that will give the impression of cleaning up the problem. But actually that's just, popping a pill to cure the symptom, the headache, but it's not actually curing what's causing the headache. And so we really need to go back to basics and solve what's the causative problem. And there it's really about controlling what's coming off our land. And there is often conservation set up as a conflict with agriculture, that agriculture, farming bad, conservation, nature good. And this sets up a really poor dichotomy, which then makes it really difficult to work across those spaces and to work with farmers. And in fact, farmers are, the people who own the countryside, who are going to be managing the countryside. They are the solution as opposed to the problem. And so what we really need to see are nature-based solutions rather than technological solutions. So here I'm thinking of, most of our rivers do not have what we call a riparian corridor, a corridor of trees and shrubs along them. They've been denuded right up to the river. And so, often cattle will get up to the river or into the river. So what we really need is almost every stream and river in the country needs to have 2 meters, 3 meters, not a huge amount of land. And this will be really marginal land that isn't highly agriculturally productive in any case. And that needs to be allowed to revegetate, to have trees, to be fenced off so that animals can't get to it. And that then forms a buffer that, soil from fields, for example, can't just wash straight off into the river. It's going to be caught by the vegetation. Similarly, how do you deal with wastewater? We have lots of slurry tanks and storage, and also when we're thinking about wastewater treatment works, the reason that there is pollution from those is about rainfall. Suddenly there's a huge amount of rainfall comes, it fills the tanks up, and we've no ability to store it anymore, and we have to release it into the rivers. So in fact, we need much better control of our wastewaters. And one of the solutions is, again, if there's unproductive land on a farm, the bottom of our squidgy field, you plant it in willows, or you plant it in rushes, and you have a drainage system that routes your spillover water into what we call a drainage swale, and the plants will take up the nutrients and store the nutrients rather than running straight into the river. So we need these nature-based solutions, and it will be those that will be the long-term solving of the problem. But of course, they take time to get into place over the next few decades. So I appreciate they're not quick fixes, but they are the long-term fix that will return the landscape to a sustainable footing. We really need to reduce the ecological impact of our agriculture and our wastewater management, and we can do that through nature, rather than trying to invent our way out of the problem. As I say to students, we've got into these problems with not only current technology but old technology, and we can solve them without modern new technology. And the same goes for climate as well. Restoring our wetlands, re-wetting our peatlands so that it's drawing down carbon, and tackling climate change. So these nature-based solutions are the solution rather than technology. And it will enrich our environment and improve our biodiversity.
Amen to that.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And maybe as a note to leave us on, I think in the current moment, Lough Neagh is a bit of a lighthouse for how things have gone wrong. And maybe looking forward to that with some further research and committed action on it, it could become a sort of example of how things can be done correctly, right? We just need lots more research money and those willing to do it, to, I guess, use Lough Neagh potentially as a case for figuring out how these nature-based solutions and others can be worked to for that restorative process to begin. So I think we'll leave it there today. Thank you so much for your time and for doing this research in the first place. Really looking forward to what comes out afterwards or follows up, whether it's yourself or others. And hopefully we'll get a chance to speak again at some other point. So again, thank you so much, and take care.
Thank you very much. It was great to talk to you.
It's lovely. Thank you.